Hey everyone. Today
Hi.
we're talking about re-engaging lapsed volunteers.
Mm.
So yeah, every nonprofit you probably experienced this where you have a dedicated volunteer or group of volunteers and then for some reason they stop showing up
Or maybe
and
they're not dedicated at all.
or they're not, they just
They
come
just
one
came
time.
once and split.
So you might think that it's a lost cause if you don't see them again or they don't return right away. But the good news is that if you maybe tweak your strategies, you can re-engage them pretty quickly because they've already been connected to your mission and probably had a great experience. Um, and so studies actually show that retaining volunteers is on average 70% less expensive than recruiting new ones. So that's a big reason to try to get past volunteers to come back. Um, so today we're going to dive into that, give you strategies and yeah. So do you want to go into why it's important to
Oh yeah,
re-engage?
definitely. So the
All right.
70% less expensive, it's not just dollars. Well, it is, it's all dollars, but it's also time. That's really the biggest thing is the energy and effort to recruit them and find them. It's the same thing as any business. The energy and effort it takes to find a new customer to where they actually buy your product, that's like 90% of the problem. And then getting them to buy again is actually a lot easier as long as the product is decent, right? So behind all of this means that the volunteer experience, your product, actually needs to be good, right? So if you don't have a good volunteer experience, then the rest of this is for naught. But the reason why having volunteers return is so important is in a lot of cases because of the time, energy, effort, and actual money that it takes to bring them in the door in the first case. And this is especially true if your onboarding process is a little bit more laborious or costly. Like if you run background checks on volunteers, or you're having people do reference checks, or there's some approval process, then we definitely want to make sure that those volunteers come back. We can leverage those existing relationships, build on them. The other big thing is that if the volunteer returns and has a good experience, then they're much more likely to bring other people in. They're much more likely to donate. They're much more likely to connect you to corporate partners. So the value increases over time. So if I have a one-time volunteer, their value is basically only within that 3 hours they're there doing that particular activity, and then it's lost forever. Whereas a returning volunteer, it's not just the incremental things they do each time, it actually kind of snowballs and grows outside of there. And
Yeah,
then, of course, go
they
ahead,
become
sorry.
like advocates for your mission and your volunteer program
Yeah, it
by keeping
it's
them come back.
it is like it's all about momentum. Like everything is about momentum, and you don't want to stop the momentum. The other big part too is that volunteers, they start accumulating more and more institutional knowledge, things about your organization, your mission, your operations, the little nuanced things that will end up making their experience and also the next volunteer's experience or the staff's experience that much easier, that much better, so that everything feels a lot more effortless. If we're constantly starting from scratch with new volunteers all the time, it's that's just a recipe for stagnation.
Mm, totally.
Yeah, one of the big things that I kind of wanted to start off with, and then I'll let Sophia take a bit of it, is one of the things that when we were talking about putting together this podcast episode, one of the first things we started talking about was sometimes how little our prospective customers or just organizations that are out there may actually know if a volunteer is new or returning. And a lot of the times that's just simply because they don't have the right systems to know. So I'm on calls all the time talking to new prospective customers and asking them questions about their volunteer programs. And it is never lost on me what a high percentage of organizations actually don't even know how many volunteers they actually have. They have really no idea how many of those volunteers are returning or if they're brand new. A lot of the times, almost in every case, it's because they just have inferior systems for tracking these things. Stuff is in Excel spreadsheets, or they're using things like Sign Up Genius or signup.com. So they basically like have sign up sheets for an event. So that becomes very complicated because I can't run a report and say, well, how many people came back? Because everybody's new every time because it's just a sign up sheet. So if I had an event last year, let's just use event volunteering as an example, and I had 500 people sign up, and then next year I go to do that event again and they go, oh, I only had 400 or I had 600. And you would say to them, well, how many of those people were from last year? And you're like, I don't know. I'd have to go manually look through both lists and see who did what. So you have to know who your volunteers are, and you have to have good systems in place to actually track what somebody did over time. And then you should be able to run reports to say, what kind of rates do we have for people returning? How many people have had multiple assignments over time? How many people have had, more than X number of hours sustained over the last, year, 2 years, 5 years? So you should be able to see all of that in whatever system you use.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the questions, so when I help an organization take their application or applications and move it over to our system where it's going to be in a centralized database, this question always makes me laugh. That's on the application. It's like, are you a returning or a new volunteer? And we end up getting rid of that question a lot of the times because every time because we don't need it anymore. Like if they're returning or not. But I'm just thinking from the volunteer perspective, if I were to answer that question, I would be like, you don't know who I am. I was here last year. It really affects how your volunteers feel when they come back.
Actually, this is an extremely good point that we didn't even talk about in advance, Sophia, is that experience that volunteer has, even when they're just applying or reapplying, if they feel that the organization is treating everybody like they're brand new, they immediately have this sense of, oh, I'm not really valued. You don't know that I was here already last year. You're asking me the same questions again. You're already starting at a bit of a negative for a returning volunteer if you do that. I have a personal example of that where I volunteered for this one organization for 4 years and continuously throughout the year, but they had different sessions. And so there were 3 sessions a year, and I had to reapply 3 times a year for 4 years. So I had to reapply 12 times, answering the same questions over and over and over again. Then I generally had this feeling, and I even know obviously what the world is about there around volunteering. But even for me, I still was like, oh, the organization as a whole doesn't really know me or care to know me. The one volunteer coordinator that I work with regularly loves me, and I have a great rapport with them. But my connection to the organization wasn't great. I was connected to that person and the people that I was providing direct services to, but not to the organization as a whole. And primarily for that reason. Like if my process had been like, welcome back, from the organization, I would have felt much better about it. Not that it stopped me from volunteering, but I certainly would have felt better about it. They might have been able to get more out of me
Yeah. Okay. I know we went off topic a little bit.
a little bit.
Um, it is all related though, because one of the things you want to do is identify the reasons that volunteers left in the first place. So to be able to do that, you got to know who they are. But we're going to talk about some of the reasons that volunteers leave, and sometimes it's out of your control. Like, for example, if they moved or their health issues, maybe family things are coming up. So if they experience any of those personal, professional changes, they might just need to stop volunteering for a while. So life changes would be one.
Yeah.
I would say like how would you recommend actually finding out something like that? Like getting
Yeah.
regular feedback from them would be a way, but
Well, the regular feedback is one thing, providing them the ability to like manage a profile where they can say, I don't want to receive communications anymore, and then asking them why. And they can say, I no longer live in the area. I moved. I had a terrible experience with you.
yeah, well, hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
But there's the reality is that we in the biz we call it churn. Like, so when you lose a volunteer, they churned, right? But the reason why you lose volunteer, or I should say, losing volunteers is a natural part of the process. Just like
Eh,
employees, like people can love working for your company, and if they quit and get another job, it just may be that they found a better opportunity, they moved, maybe there was something that was in more alignment with them. Maybe they, wanted to go home to raise their children. Who knows what it is? It's a normal part of the process. So don't be scared of it. So that first portion of it is just sometimes life gets in the way, and maybe they just don't have the time anymore, and it really doesn't have anything. It's not about you or the organization. So it's a healthy part of the process. And it also gives us the opportunity to bring in some new people and mix things up a little bit more. Sometimes we'll have
mhm.
organizations where they like have the same 50 volunteers and they've had them forever. That's actually a problem. So you actually, it's healthy to introduce new personalities and have some people leave, some people come in, because that means that you're finding your groove, kind of thing. So life changes are a big
Right.
one. Another one that I'll interject is Probably the biggest one, which is that they didn't feel like the last time they volunteered that their time was really well utilized, that they didn't make the impact that they thought that they would make, that their time was wasted. They got there and they stood around. There were too many people. There were too few people. People didn't know my name. They didn't know that I've been volunteering here for a year. Nobody thanked me. I wasn't recognized in any way. I don't see what the point of this activity is. There's that sort of stuff. So if they don't feel like that their time, which is a super valuable asset, was well utilized, um, then they're not going to come back. I mean, really, they're doing this 100% because they're giving the gift of their time. And if somebody looked at that gift and they felt like they kind of went, eh, you know,
Mm.
I don't,
Yeah.
then are they going to come back? Of course, they're not going to. So um, we want to make sure that we're acknowledging, expressing gratitude, communicating constantly, which sort of leads into the next element, which is really like, well, how when a volunteer feels unappreciated or undervalued, why is that? Like 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 what is the reason for that feeling?
Yeah, it's as simple as no one communicated it to them, or it wasn't communicated in any way. Like maybe there wasn't a thank you notice or email that went out, or just someone never said we value you in any way. So um, communication is a big piece of this. And it's difficult when you have lots of volunteers and you don't necessarily have the most up-to-date information on them. It's like, what's the best way to communicate what they should be doing, what you expect from them, different opportunities that they can get involved in. So, like, they kind of just go dark.
I would say in most instances, and you can even think about this in personal relationships, it's almost always about communication, right? Because if you have good programs and you're a good nonprofit and you have a good cause, usually people are attracted to you because of your mission, because of your cause. They find some alignment personally there. And the rest of it is either there was an operational failure, which I'll get into in a minute, or things just weren't communicated so that they know. So did we acknowledge them when they initially signed up? Did we remind them and tell them how excited we were to see them? When they arrived, were they given clear instructions on where they needed to be so there was no confusion? Were they greeted with a smile and a thank you? Were they given clear instructions on what they're supposed to be doing and the impact that they're going to be making as a result? Were they thanked on their way out the door? Were they sent a follow-up asking them for their feedback? And then what was the communication like asking them to return? Were they ever asked to return? Maybe they were never asked. And it was like, sometimes I'll have people go, yeah, I never came back. And you're like, well, did you ask them to come back? And they're like, well, I thought they would if they enjoyed themselves. So the
Right.
communication is almost always where I would start, right? But then you
Yeah.
could go onto the operational side and say, well, maybe you kind of fumbled the football when they go, maybe your communication was fantastic, but the actual experience wasn't good, right? So what can lead to the experience not being good might be typically like one of two things. Either your processes, the different roles volunteers would be taking on weren't well structured, right? Like if for example, I'll throw out a silly example, but if I were a food bank and I had volunteers come in and all you wanted to do was for them to stack cans, you know, you might be like, well, that's kind of a lame volunteer experience. They're not really able to really make an impact. So maybe we need to restructure these jobs so that we're taking full advantage of the time, energy, and effort that is being put into them, right?
Mm.
Or it's actually a mismatch of skills. So the volunteer comes in, they have a certain set of skills, but they're put in a job where they're not going to be successful in that job. So I'll stick with the food bank or food pantry kind of example. You take somebody who is a super social person and loves to interact with people, but can't lift a 20-pound weight. And you take them and you put them in the back and you ask them to store 25-pound bags of rice in the warehouse. Big mismatch in skills and interests. And so the volunteer's experience is not going to be optimal. Conversely, sometimes we'll have volunteers that are, introverts and they don't like being out in front of people. And you have them at the front of the store, greeting people, communicating to them on what they should be doing. They would much rather be in the back loading stuff into boxes. So there does have to be part of every application that we recommend to people is what are people's skills, what are their capabilities, and what are their interests. And we want to make sure that we match those things with their assignments. And that actually the best way to do that, aside from having the really good, well-defined jobs and roles, is self-selection. Volunteers are really good at picking things that they're qualified to do and would like to do and are capable of doing. And sometimes we'll have customers that sort of insist on gatekeeping that, and they want to put volunteers where they think would be the best spot. And there is a time and a place for that. Medical volunteering for one. Like I'm not going to put any volunteer into a critical care kind of situation. But for most cases, it's the volunteer does a far better job saying, here's something I would like to do, because people don't want to fail at things. They want to make a difference, they want to make an impact, and they want to enjoy themselves. So they're more likely to pick jobs that will match that.
Awesome. So let's go on to the next part, which is how do we actually approach re-engaging volunteers? So let's say the first way is to send a personalized email, um, or make a phone call, just reach out to them, send a text. And I would say that you want to make it personal too. So don't just say, like, don't just send a general email out. Maybe, like we said, if you're collecting data on different interests that they have, personalize the invitation, like, oh, we have this new administrative role, and target the people who said that they want to be on the back end a little bit more. So there are different things you can do when you reach out to reconnect. But also, I love when I see a newsletter go out from an organization. Sometimes I get copied on those, and they do a wonderful job of like including pictures and really good text that invites people to come back. And I could totally see how those types of campaigns encourage people. They're, oh yeah, I did like volunteering there, and they go ahead and get re-engaged. But just initiate something, invite them.
It seems like such an obvious thing, but we see it routinely where it just doesn't happen. So
Right.
and your point about making it personal is also very, very on point. The newsletters are great. These are these reminders of why you were connected to our mission in the first place, the impact that you were able to make, the impact that people there are still continuing to make without you, but we would love to have you. We're these different touch points, we're reminding them about that. But if more you can make it personal, like I got an email to me, like a big BCC email is good, but what's really good is if it's personalized.
The
And
other thing is, if you have good systems, like, don't send or try not to send "we missed you" email to people who volunteered last week. Like, be able to report on who's been kind of out of the loop for a little while and re-engage them.
yeah, well, that goes back to the very beginning when we were talking about knowing who they are, what they did, who's returning, who's not returning. So like in our product, for example, I can go and say, give me people who have had no activity for a certain amount of time. So if I wanted to do that and say, hey, we haven't seen you in a month, we haven't seen you in 6 months, we haven't seen you in a year, we want to re-engage you, you can pull up those individuals, you can send them merged, personalized things so it's addressed to them. And there's lots of things that you could do there. Yeah, so reconnecting, doing it personally, and if you have good systems, that shouldn't be too difficult. Um, Obviously, the other strategy for re-engaging volunteers is to actually address the reasons why they didn't return. So we already talked about those different things, right? Some of them we can't control, like life changes, they moved out of the area, et cetera. And but the other ones, feeling unappreciated or undervalued, a mismatch in the type of work that they were doing, better communication. Um, if we can address those barriers and get better at this, then obviously we'll lose fewer people. So one of the things that we learned a long time ago was getting volunteer feedback was so critical. And most of the feedback that we see people tend to get is more anecdotal. Like it's only the squeaky wheel volunteers that walk up to you and say, you know what we should do? You know, we should have more chairs, it's just whatever the recommendation is. And so then you're only getting like the people who, I mean, it's valuable, don't get me wrong, but it actually is better if you have some sort of process for going out and getting feedback from people who may or may not otherwise give it to you. So like we have an
Yeah.
entirely automated process within our product that sends out requests for give feedback, and they can write in surveys. I was just yesterday looking at a customer of ours, Cornell University, and they we were looking at their feedback. And I always find it so interesting, the the amounts of little things that people report back that will make a big difference if you correct them. So sometimes we're a little shy or worried about asking for feedback because, let's face it, all of us have a little nagging voice in the back of our head that says, you didn't do enough, you stink. So
Yeah. Oh
then
my goodness.
as a result, you don't ask for the feedback because you're afraid of what you're going to hear, right? But what we find time and again is that in almost every circumstance, people are very happy with their experience, or the thing that did happen was kind of like, oh, that's an easy thing to correct. Or just, I didn't even know that was happening. That's, thank God I know now. It's not really ever been something where people come back and go, oh, you stink, right? So feedback surveys are huge, and we advocate for them happening routinely and often. So sometimes people will do annual feedback surveys. Again, those are not awful. They're good. They're not great. And the reason why they're not great is people forget. And when you ask somebody once a year about their experience in the previous year, they're not going to remember all of the little things that would have made a big difference. It may not even occur to them. They may have long forgotten about it. So you sort of get an opportunity to correct things once a year, as opposed to if you have these iterative requests for feedback, somebody gets a little thing, they can rate it real quick and type something in, then you're getting these iterative things, and you start getting smaller things, which make a big difference and are easy to implement. So that's a big one.
And they're quicker to fill out for the volunteer. Like if it's a 3 question survey about what they just did, then it's less daunting to like, oh, I got to sit down and give a year's worth of feedback. But
Yeah.
all right.
Point.
Yeah, so another thing I want to talk about is creating incentives for volunteers. Kind of make it fun, host special events, maybe like a workshop or yeah, skills workshop or something, provide new training. Just use those different things to incentivize volunteers to make another touch point with your organization. So,
Yeah, even
yeah,
even having a volunteer appreciation event and
yeah.
making sure you invite past volunteers to that event, and you might even customize the thing to them, like, listen, even though you haven't volunteered in a while, we still appreciate you and we want you back. And so we're going to have pizza and balloons, and it's those little things where people just need that little nudge and reminder to go, I really did have a great, I need to get back, because all of us are well intentioned, right? Life is so busy. Even when you're retired, life is busy. I hear more from my in-laws and my parents that they're so busy, and yet they don't have to work full-time jobs, but that's the way life is. So people get wrapped up in what they have going on. That everybody's well-meaning. These things get in the way of us coming back and doing something we actually really enjoyed in the past. And so the more we can entice them and give them incentives to come back, the more that they'll have those reminders that they're so appreciated and that they're making such a difference. So one of the things too that is just another idea I'll throw out there before we wrap up is that, and we've talked about utilizing technology to make these things easier on yourself, like getting feedback, making personalized calls or emails to recruit volunteers back in, addressing all of the little things, feedback that comes back to see like how we can make continuous improvements. And so the technology is a big part, but one of the other things to think about is how can we utilize volunteers to do those things to get more volunteers to return, right? So
Yeah.
actually getting like let's just say, for example, you have 1,000 volunteers and you're sitting there going, Sophia, I'm not calling 1,000 volunteers, right? We have 2,000 people in our database and only 300 of them volunteered within the last 6 months, right? So that's 1,700 people you're saying I should call or do a personalized. I don't have the time for that. And you go, okay, well, you do have a few hundred volunteers that are available. What if you just asked each of them to call 10 people? Just call 10
Yeah.
people and say, hey, listen, the organization really appreciated that you volunteered last year. We noticed that you hadn't been back. We would love to hear from you, even if it's just to provide you your feedback on your experience. But what we would really love is if you'd come back and help us more because we appreciate what you did. All you have to do then is give them a list of people. You can completely steal that little script that I just put out there and just ask them to call 10 people. And then all of a sudden, that doesn't seem so insurmountable. And this obviously is a reflection of the power of volunteerism, because with staff, it would be a burdensome task. It would be overly costly and probably impossible with everything you have going on. But if you can do a little bit of work up front and just pull together a list and come up with a script, you can hand that and say to those people, hey, could you do me a favor and call 10 people? And the other thing too is that when you hear from a member of the staff, a paid employee of an organization asking you for something, whether it's a donation of their finances or a donation of their time, it's good, it's great. But what's really, really powerful is when somebody who's not being paid to do it does it. The authenticity of the request comes through so much more. If somebody calls and said, hey, listen, I'm a volunteer with the same organization that you volunteered with, we would love to see you back. They asked me to give you a call. Is like, oh, this is actually my peer. Nobody's being paid to do this. The authenticity of the requests really shines through.
I love that idea. That's awesome.
All right,
There's
so
power in numbers.
there's huge power in numbers, and there's power in commitment to mission. One of the things I will say, this is, and again, a little bit of an offshoot, is that one of the things I'm continually impressed by working in this industry is actually how committed staff are to the organization's mission. Like, it attracts a certain type of person, and they actually will more than likely work there because they themselves are attached to the mission. They believe that they're doing a good thing by working for this company. So I don't want to diminish the authentic nature of staff because it's definitely there. But having a volunteer do it it's just a little notch that says, ooh, and they're not even being paid to do this. Like, they're doing this on their own free accord. All
Yeah,
right, so
definitely making.
wrapping up,
Go ahead.
you want me to or you want to?
Yeah, do a quick recap.
Okay, quick recap. Recap. We have to know who our volunteers are. We have to have good systems to even know who the heck is a first timer versus returning. Is this their first time returning, or are they a habitual returner? Right? We have to have good systems to know who those people are so that we know how to address the fact that we either have a lot of people not returning or we have a lot of people returning. We have to understand why they're not returning when they do. And we also can appreciate that there's a natural churn, as I used that term before, where people do just come and go for no fault of the organizations or the volunteers, but that there may be other things that we can do to make sure that their experience is one to increase the likelihood that they'll return. And that is, in part, most of it is communications. We talked about that. All of these this relationship building, confirmation that they signed up, reminders that we're excited to see them coming, that walk in the door and they're greeted by somebody, their instructions on what they do is clearly presented, the jobs have been structured in a way that they're going to be fulfilling, they were thanked afterwards, they were invited back, and the jobs that they were matched to, the jobs they were actually doing, was a good match for their own skills, abilities, and interests. And um, and then we also want to make sure that when we do reconnect with people, that we are reconnecting with them personally, that we have these communication touch points where we're giving them reminders of the value that they gave the last time, the good experience that they had in the past, and the good experience they'll have in the future. Newsletters, Sophia brought up, along with personalized emails or phone conversations, actually addressing all of the things that might come back from feedback, getting iterative feedback from volunteers throughout the year so that we know how to make those small shifts and changes that are going to make a big difference in the experience. Maybe creating incentives to return. Sophia said, host a welcome back event or just a volunteer appreciation event and invite past volunteers to that. And to leverage other volunteers in that process to make sure volunteers return or to reclaim them. So that we use that example of saying, I have 1,000 volunteers, but if I had 100 volunteers calling 10 people each, that's totally doable. Just put together a list, distribute 10 to each people, and give them a short script as to how we would like them to come back. So that's how was
That's your
that as a
recap.
wrap up? Is
That
that good?
was such a good recap. I just want to say if you found this helpful, please subscribe, click the notification bell. We release episodes every 2 weeks. And also share this with another nonprofit who you think might benefit, or someone within your nonprofit who needs to hear this message. And we'll see you next time. But thank you for
Yay.
listening.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.